Welcome Exiles to my Divine Iron Inquisitor. This build has some great building blocks to it and results in a very tanky character that actually does a hell of a lot of damage. We're building around Doryani's prototype, something that is insanely strong in this league thanks to reflected jewelry, and I'm going to walk you guys through how to make some gear with that where it's actually pretty consistent and very affordable in most cases until the reflection of Kalandra gets expensive. We also use Rathpith Globe, which means if we scale life, we scale damage. You'll notice this character has over 8,000 life, 1k ES, 4k regen per second, 70 spell block, 40+% attack block, over 20k armor, a decent amount of fire res, and tempered by war, so lightning degens don't even kill us. We can stand in a mana siphoner, and we will not die. We can have a large amount of time, I'd say ample amount of time, to respond to a Shaper Beam. And not just any Shaper Beam, I'm talking Uber Shaper Beam. We did this test on stream and it was actually pretty easy to dodge out of that beam. We had a lot of time to respond to it. Now let's go in game. Now that we're in game, I just want to go through the building blocks of the character, break it down for you guys bit by bit. So to start off with, we're building around Doryani's prototype. This chess piece has a simple rule. Whatever your lightning res is, that's the res of the enemies near you. And by near you, it's actually a pretty large area. Basically, if they're on screen, they're going to have the same resistance as you. So with my character, I have roughly about roughly about negative 151 lightning res. Now, this normally would actually be negative 300, but we're using tempered by war. Something normally you can't fit into a Doryani's prototype because it gives you 50% less lightning resistance, but because the jewelry you can get with Kalandra, it makes it very, very easy to get a lot of negative lightning res in your gear, and you can start to fit this in. With our character, we take advantage of these jewelry pieces, which are actually quite easy to craft. I'm going to walk you through it. You get a ring with fractured life or fractured lightning res. You then get a deafening essence of scorn. You use this until you hit a decent life number or a decent resistance. It could be fire or cold, and you simply will go over to your harvest benchcraft and you will say, I want to change my fire or my cold resistance to lightning or my fire resistance to lightning. The idea is you're going to have 3 mods in your item. It's going to be lightning res, crit multi, and life. You then are going to craft on something like minimum frenzy charge, minimum endurance, or minimum power. Kind of up to you. Minimum frenzy I think is the best use case. And how this works is you throw that into a reflection of Kalandra, and you have roughly about a 30 to 40% chance that you're going to get life with good crit multi with negative lightning res. If you hit the plus on frenzies, that's just a bigger win. It's not necessary to make the character extremely strong, but it helps add to the power level. And the idea is, if you're crafting a ring and you're slamming these with essences, most cases you'll get a extra mod on there, like mana for us, for example, where if it goes negative, it's not a bad downside. If you do essence spam into an item where it has a mod that would be really bad for the build if it went negative, then I would recommend either annulling that mod or keep essence spamming until you get basically other mods that are dead mods, so that way if they go negative, they're not bricking your build. The idea is to increase the likelihood you get a good usable ring when you put it into the reflection of Kalandra. Now for Reflection of Kalandra, as far as how much of a multiplier you're going to get on your mods, from what I've gathered, a difficulty 1 is a 1.5 multiplier, difficulty 2, 1.6 multiplier, difficulty 3, 1.7, difficulty 4, 1.8, and then at difficulty 5, it goes to 1.85, and for the rest of the difficulties from here on out, they start progressing by 0.05. So difficulty 6, 1.9, difficulty 7, 1.95, difficulty 8, that's when you get 2 times multiplier, so you need at least a level 8 difficulty if you want to double, for example, for +2. This is important when we go to Amulet Craft. Amulet Craft, you're going to want to grab a fractured +1 either lightning or all skill gem amulet, and you're going to spam this again with Essence of Scorn. And this is something where you just want to spam this until you hit life. You can also get something like a fractured amulet and spam with Deafening Essence of Scorn and just lose 2 lightning levels. That is fine. You will still do plenty of damage for basically all the content, and it will guarantee you have good life, and you can just do that until you hit lightning res. So if you're going for the min-max amulet, a little bit better, fractured skill gem. If you don't want to min-max that much, you want to have a higher chance of hitting the doubling on the Kalandra for the correct mods, then you go for fractured life instead of fractured +2. same idea here. When you have extra open affixes, go for minimum charges or go for a mod that it just isn't a downside for you, and minimum charges generally aren't. If you already have +2 minimum frenzy on another ring, then go for like +2 endurance charge or +1 power and have that get doubled instead. So that is the idea behind the jewelry. When you're doing this, if you're just going for basically life and crit multi, it's about a 40% chance you're going to hit those two mods going positive, and then maybe there's basically 4 out of 10 outcomes that give you those two mods together. If you hit those two mods together, I think it might be one of those outcomes that you have lightning res be also positive. So it's a 30% chance for the big win-win, and it's a small chance that you get a ring that's actually really good and you probably could sell it to somebody else because it has over 100 res, it has over 50 crit multi and 200 life, whatever. You can sell it to somebody else, but when you hit the minus lightning res, that's when you're hitting the ideal situation, and that's the more likely outcome. So that goes over the jewelry. That's a pretty simple concept, and that's how you craft really good gear for Doryani's prototype. Now, the rest of my gear, don't be intimidated by it. All you really need to go for is fractured either life regenerate or fractured life or fractured chaos res. Moral of the story is you're just trying to get a decent fractured affix, then use an essence for like Essence of Greed, Essence of Envy for Chaos Res. Use something like that and either spam the item till you get life regenerate. Then pretty much you're going for 3 important mods. You're going for life, you're going for regenerate, and you're going for like some okay resistance. You'll see that's the case for all of my gear. It's not particularly min-max. There's definitely improvements I could do on these gear pieces, but the idea is we're getting a lot of life regenerate, so that way when we have this sort of regenerate all kicked into the build, you'll see we have over about 5,000 regen per second between our life pool and our ES pool, which ends up making us feel quite cozy against degens and stuff of that nature. You'll see I reserve these. Sorry, it's kind of bugging me to look at these things not being properly reserved. Alrighty. So, besides those affixes, besides all that, what's the important building block of this build? It's Rathpith Globe. This shield says, hey, the more life you stack, the more spell damage and the more crit chance you get. So with our character, on our passive tree, we end up grabbing quite a bit of life nodes. We're prioritizing high life areas, and we're prioritizing some of the good nodes around them. And the idea behind this character is, when you have the situation where you have a Rathpith Globe, it says sacrifice 10% life when you use a skill. Now, why do we choose Divine Ire? Well, it comes into this item. You'll see, if I press Divine Ire, we lose 10% life every time we do that. Now, if I press and hold, I only spend that 10% life every time I go to channel for the full channeling thing. That means it ends up being we're spending 10% life every 3 seconds or every 4 seconds, which is kind of just trivial compared to how much damage put out we're getting from Rathpith and the amount of regen we have on our character. So that's kind of the beautiful synergy we got going on. The reflected jewelry with Doryani is absolutely magnificent. Really, you can do this with any lightning build and it's going to feel good. Then you mix in Rathpith Globe with something like a channeling skill and you get a lot of damage output. Originally, the build was playing around Galvanic Field and the high uptime damage skill where I didn't have to cast it very much. Unfortunately, that skill kind of just sucks or is bad or is bugged. I don't know. Point is, don't use it. Also, another thing I mentioned earlier, Tempered by War. This is something where you don't use this until you got some pretty good negative lightning res jewelry, but once you do, it means your character's not going to die to degens, you're not going to die to random lightning hits. It means half the damage that would be a lightning hit is taken to another element, which means the armor we do have on our character, which we get about 20k with flasks up, actually helps mitigate a decent amount of lightning damage. On top of the fact, when the damage goes into fire, we have an 81 max res. This goes to 83 if we're near unique enemies, or you could have it constantly be 83 if you just min-maxed your implicits harder on the Eldritch currencies. I didn't personally take the time to do that. I didn't want to spend that much, so that's some ways you could upgrade the character. Now, all in all, that's a lot of the building blocks. One last thing for crafting I should go over is belt and scepter. For the belts, you want to go for just something like an Elder belt and spam a basically pristine fossils on it until you get good percent life, good flat life, and regen and life recovery. You're just basically going for a nice mixture of those stats. You'll see on this belt I got good percent life, good flat regen, and some life recovery rate, but I got bad flat life. It's still a pretty solid belt even though we hit so badly on the flat life. You know, it's something you could min-max further if you wanted to, but that's what we went for. Ultimately, start with an Elder Leather belt until you can upgrade to a Stygian Vise. They're a little bit more expensive as a baseline. And last but not least, the Scepter Craft. This is actually not going to be an item I recommend to you. I'm actually going to recommend doing a Profane Wand. This specifically was when I was originally planning around using a weapon that where I didn't really care too much about the cast speed. Now that we have a skill where we care about the cast speed, a profane wand or a percent cast speed implicit wand is going to be much better. I recommend going for either fractured crit multi, fractured basically +1 lightning, fractured flat lightning, fractured +1 fizz, stuff like that would all work. And I would do either a process of spamming Essences of Misery for cast speed, or do a fossil combination of metallic, corroded, and shuddering with a item that's level 82 or lower. This should guarantee getting you a +1 to a all spell, and it might force on +1 chaos. When it does, it's about a 1 in 6 to get a 6 mod outcome on a fractured item. If it does that, your goal is to try to annul the +1 chaos and do a harvest augment. If you have crafted cannot roll attacks, a harvest augment will force on a +1 fizz onto the prefixes of the item, and then it's a random annul, so it either could take off your +1 all, or it could take off one of your bad suffixes, which would open up a suffix, which means you could craft on cast speed, or you could craft on crit multi, depending on what you have fractured on the item. Those are kind of your options to work with, but I definitely would recommend a wand with the cast speed implicit over the scepter I have here. This was just when I was optimizing for a build that wasn't going to be casting very much. Whew, it's a lot of breathful. For the flasks, go for regen. Always go for regen. The best mod on these builds is probably going to be gain charges when you get hit. I didn't really min-max these crafts, but I would go for gain charge when you get hit, use when charges reach full sort of enchant. This sort of setup means you don't press the flask, they activate when they're necessary, and they'll help give you basically nice mitigation, nice survival. As for the skills on the build, Arcanist Brand plus Assassin Marks, we just put this down before bosses. It gives us Assassin Mark on bosses, gives us some nice DPS boosts. Then we have our Shield Charge, our movement, faster attacks. We have Culling Strike, Flame Dash, plus Arcane Surge. This just procs Arcane Surge for damage, and it gives us Culling Strike, which we can use to finish off a boss. Usually, you're going to be one-tapping or two-tapping bosses, and this doesn't factor in. It only really factors in on uber bosses when you're like getting to that last HP and you just want to finish them off. After that, we have skills like Frost Shield, Increased Duration, and Molten Shell. This is basically our defensive powerhouses. If you use a Frost Shield, you're sitting in there, you're going to be extremely tanky. And then Molten Shell is just a little extra juice if you're about to get hit by a bunch of attacks all at once. It's a nice thing to proc. After that, we have ourselves Onslaught, plus Tempest Shield, plus Arrogance level 20, plus Vitality. This is something you have to gauge the Vitality level based on how much HP you have. You want to have your life reserved be just a slight amount less than your life you can heal up to with Petrified Blood. This means with Leech from the Glove implicit, you will overleech, and you will benefit from things like damage while leeching. Stats like that will feel good, and Leech will be extra sustained in the build on top of our 5k regen per second, which will feel very good. After that, auras, we have Determination and Purity of Fire, along with Divergent Righteous Fire. Righteous Fire, damage, can't live without it. As for Purity of Fire, this is damage mitigation for Righteous Fire, and for the damage we're taking from other elements. It makes our max res go higher, feels good for tankiness. And then Determination, this is just getting some extra armor in the build, so that way we don't completely fall over to Fizz, we get a little bit of nice mitigation against it. We're still going to die to one-shots from maybe like Uber Shaper Slams, but for the most part, most other Fizz attacks we will be able to absorb, especially considering our high life pool, our Leech, and our Regen. Whew. Sorry guys, I'm kind of losing my throat a little bit here. Next up, you get a Red Nightmare, and this slot gives you about 10% attack block. That's why we can get to a decent block number of about 46 here. That's thanks to Red Nightmare. It also means we generate endurance charges while mapping, which give us a healthy amount of extra Fizz mitigation. After that, we have a Lethal Pride in this location, means we have to spend 1 point to get here. Ideally, you want to try to get double damage is good, life regen is good, stuff like that. That'll be good in this spot. It's not OP, but it's just a way to get tempered by war. Again, I wouldn't use this until you have some decent minus lightning res jewelry to be able to still get around -150. This obviously we could get more damage in this build if you start going for a melding, if you start going for something like a Sublime Vision for Purity of Ice. You could start getting some extra mitigation, some weirder setups, stuff you could make work, but ultimately that's going to require more gearing to set up, a little bit more effort, and I didn't really want to put in that effort, right? I would have to get a lot more res on top of what I already have. I didn't want to deal with it. So, hopefully I've broken down the building blocks of this character well enough. The defensive layers, 70 block for spells, about 45 block for attacks, 20k armor, high fire res with tempered by war, that's our mitigation layers, and then we have about a 9k EHP pool with Petrified Blood, with 5k regen per second, and Overleech. The character is very well rounded, I would say, and ultimately its weakest point is just mapping. I think when I'm looking at these links here, I'd like to swap faster casting for an awakened increased AoE. I think that would make the mapping feel better. Just kind of one tapping packs and stuff like that. It's not going to be OP for clear, but it's good enough. It's decent once you get some cast speed, get old cast speed 1. I think it'll be a well-rounded character. Not OP for mapping, mainly strongest suited for bossing. It can do all the content. I did all of them today on stream, and it went pretty well. Overall, pretty happy with the character. I'm bummed out about Galvanic Field not working, but after trying Divine Ire, it was a pleasure. It was quite enjoyable to play with, and of course you could definitely take this skeleton of this character and you could make a lot of different things with it. You could probably make a pretty potent lightning conduit build. You could probably do a lot of other things. Let your own imagination run free and maybe make something of it if you have some good ideas to mold this character and even make him better than it already is. So hopefully you've enjoyed this video, as Exiles. As always, take care.